I remember asking my mother once, I had this one experience with our neighbor downstairs, and I said, Mom, why do people cry on New Year's? And just, want to know why. And she said something about they're grieving whatever losses they have had, or that another year has passed and they made it through. And it was just that. Wow. I think I was 12 when she said that. I'm like, oh my gosh, the struggle.
What's up, everybody? I go by the name of Domo.
And I go by the name of Yoshiko.
And each week, we sit down with cultural ambassadors
to talk about how they defied societal norms
to live their lives
with no blueprint.
I am a person that comes from a immigrant family. I'm the firstborn. Not firstborn in my family, but first generation to be born in the United States. I am someone who's had an experience that sometimes has felt like I'm not really connected to anything specific, and that I'm living in like parallel worlds. My home life, and it's a blend of cultures. I grew up in a household that was half Puerto Rican and half Argentinian, and those two cultures are really different, and in the backdrop of the Bronx in New York City, and in an environment where I was encouraged to be really American, and I didn't even know what that meant. I think if I answer that question, like, who am I? I'm someone who's learning how to be myself, in this life right now, and figuring out what is community, what is home, what's my purpose, what's my place, and how can I serve?
That's deep.
It is.
Super deep. That was good. You said a lot there to unpackage.
Right?
How do you define culture?
I saw that question and was like, why would you ask me that? It's really a deep question for me, because for me, culture means a number of different things. I don't even want to call it a synergy. It's more like a Rubik's Cube of things that includes language, music, food, non-verbal communication. I'm thinking about things like the look my mother gave me when I'm not supposed to be doing something. There's a look that only she gave. And I'm sure that's part of mother culture as much as it is Puerto Rican mother culture. Right. But it's definitely a cultural thing, because it's only something that I would see and I understand. And everyone else is like, hey, your mother didn't make a face. I'm like, oh, yeah, she did. She made a face. I saw and it's a face that stops me right in my tracks. So there's nonverbal communication. There's a blend of things. I think I mentioned food, but food was such a core part of my experience of culture. There was the culture of spirituality and religion. Those were two distinct things in my household. The culture of being part of a multi-generational household, and seeing, my grandmother and my grandfather were a big part of my upbringing, and parts of how they behaved were like they never left Puerto Rico. Okay. And so that was in our household, and my brother and I are like listening to Michael Jackson and Prince and Bruce Springsteen, and and my grandma's like, what is that music? In Spanish. She's like, ¿Qué es eso? Hey. I don't like it. It's noisy. It's MJ. I would say, Jay, what are you talking about? So, a combination of those things. And I think for me, culture is really ingrained in movement and dance. And there's also, I had a real keen awareness of different types of culture. As I was growing up, the culture in my household was different from the culture in my building, from the culture on my block, from the culture in the school I went to. And I started working at a video store right down the street from where I lived when I was 12, like when I could actually get a work license. Wow. And that was and then I realized, oh my gosh, there's a work culture too. Right. And it's a cool one in a video store, I have to say. but it had its own distinct culture. And it blew my mind to have to navigate all of those different, environments and then figure out there's also me in there too. Like I'm figuring out what it means to be American. And so I have this subculture living in a subculture, living in a subculture, and you just keep going. And that's why for me, it feels like a Rubik's Cube.
That is such an amazing analogy.
Yeah.
You play with a Rubik's Cube and you just can't get it to...
I can't. I've never.
But it's fun and it's pretty and you just can't somehow get it back to the way it was.
Right.
When all the colors were the same, but matching, right? I used to just peel off.
Yes.
Peel off some sticker.
There's some where you can just pull blocks off. You just pull the blocks off and then put them back together.
That's funny. Shout out to all the people that are cheating on Rubik's Cubes.
And then for people who are like, I'm Rubik's Cube, I need to Google that.
Right.
What is that?
Right. What is that? Have you ever seen Pursuit of Happiness? No.
So what brought your family to the States?
So I was thinking about this. They came at different times. So my mother and her family came to the States from Puerto Rico when my mother was a teenager. So it was in the 50s. They came for the same reason my father came. They came for a better life. I think it was easier to find work in the U.S. And there were, I want to say, thousands of Puerto Ricans in New York City. Or like there's a series, and I'm blanking out the name of the documentary, the name of the producer and the director, but it was called the New York series. And there's a whole episode on the influx of Puerto Ricans that came to New York in the 50s and 60s. And so my grandmother, her husband they were part of that wave, them and their 3 kids. And my mother was one of the 3 kids came to the U.S. In the 50s. And so my mother was a teenager. She's the middle child. And she has an older sister and a younger brother.
Okay.
And they ended up not in the Bronx first. So I was born and raised in the Bronx, but they ended up in Manhattan. And at a time where it was a little bit more affordable to live there.
Manhattan is crazy.
Right. And people left Manhattan to go to the Bronx because it became more affordable if you wanted to have a family to live in the Bronx. And so my mother, when she met my father, and I'll talk about how he came to the States in a moment, when they met and they got married, I think in 1970, they decided if they wanted to have a family, they needed to live in a bigger apartment, not even a home, in a bigger apartment. And so they moved to the Bronx. And that's where, even though my brother was born in Manhattan, he was first born, they were living in the Bronx at the time. And it had everything to do with affordability and being able to expand in the household, to have more space, living space. And that meant a 1-bedroom or a 2-bedroom versus a studio apartment. And so my father was an adult when he came to the U.S. from Argentina, and he came when he was in his 20s. And I think he was in his late 20s, and it was in the late 60s. He came on his own without family. He didn't know anyone. He just knew that there was opportunity.
Wow.
And there are enough people that don't speak English in New York that he was able to find a Spanish-speaking culture, a Spanish-speaking community. And he got work pretty quickly as a glazer. He was always into woodworking and manual labor, but
what's a glazer?
A glazer is someone who basically cuts commercial glass, and installs it in buildings, apartment buildings, and commercial buildings and storefronts. So when I walk around Manhattan, I see all of these buildings that I know my father installed the frames and glass. And so he's no longer with us. So he passed away in 2002. So I feel like his soul is in New York. Like these businesses, like Pick a Bagel is one of the businesses. He did all the storefronts for Pick a Bagel, and the French Roast, which is a chain restaurant, and there are a number of other places. But whenever I walk by them, I get emotional just thinking about that's his energy, his creativity went into putting these storefronts, or in apartment buildings, putting up the windows or doorways. So he came in the 1960s, in the late 60s, on his own. He was essentially an orphan. His mother and father passed away when he was young, and his sister raised him in Argentina. And he always felt like the black sheep in the family and never really felt connected. So when he had an opportunity to leave, he ran away and saved to come to the States. He did, and I think he had $25 in his pocket.
Wow.
You know, I might be exaggerating. Maybe it was like 40, but it wasn't much beyond that.
Right.
Like truly, like in a time where I have a dream to build a life for myself and start over and to be anonymous.
Right. In New York City.
Yeah, which, you know, and he did really well for himself for a while.
Right. How did him and your mother meet?
I don't remember. I think it's so funny. I was thinking about them. Like, I don't remember how they met, but I think they met through a mutual friend.
Okay.
And my mother was 5 years older than my father, which if you think about that day and age, that's not a common, it's not a common thing. So my mother was 5 years older than my father. She was working as a hairdresser at Macy's at the time. Macy's on 34th Street, which is like the big famous Macy's in Manhattan. So she was working there, a career woman as a hairdresser, and she met my father, and I think they got married pretty quickly. You know, they dated for a little bit and got married, and my brother came along in 1972. It was a couple of years after they got married.
Yeah.
Culturally, they were really different. You know, it's so funny to be, I don't know if we experience this so much here in Seattle, but I think I've had this conversation with you, Dominique, where like in New York, like Puerto Ricans don't get along with Argentinians, or, you know, Dominicans don't get along with Hondurans. It's like ridiculous. It's not really true. But I remember like my mother always telling me, you know, when you tell people you're half Puerto Rican and half Argentinian, if they make a face, don't worry, because we're just really different culturally. You know, there's the Caribbean nature of the Puerto Rican experience, and then there's kind of the more indigenous experience of, you know, the native Argentinians. And so my father was a native Argentinian, not from the influx of people that came from Europe that ended up in Argentina.
Right.
So did you ever get funny looks when you mentioned you were half Puerto Rican, half Argentinian?
I did in Mexico.
Really?
Yeah, when I went to Mexico, I can't remember the exact interaction, but I remember this man asking me, you know, where are you from? You know, where's your family from? And I said, well, my mother was born and raised in Puerto Rico, and my father was born and raised in Argentina. And he was like, oh. He was like, oh, well, those are interesting. Yeah, they are. I think so. I think they're interesting. And now that was one experience. But it was the only time that ever happened.
Wow. Were you an adult by then?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. It was in my 30s. It's like, this, after all of these years, hearing this could happen.
Mom, you're preparing for the moment.
Mom, it happened.
I called my mother. I did. I was like, this happened? Like you said it would, but it was the only time it happened.
That's hilarious.
And I didn't really know how to follow up. I was on a work trip, and so I didn't really know how to follow up that conversation with, what do you mean by interesting? I think the facial expression, which again, facial expressions to me are a big part of culture. And it gave me the cue of, maybe don't follow up on that.
Just end it.
Maybe just end it, let it go, you know, because I don't think this conversation would end well otherwise.
Right. What was it like growing up in the Bronx?
Awesome. And so growing up in the Bronx, oh boy, I started out saying awesome, and yet I couldn't wait to get out of there. I think what was so awesome about growing up in the Bronx was the diversity. In my building, which now has a name. Like I drove by my building on this last trip to New York. I mean, I grew up, and I'm going to say this, 2156 Kruger Avenue. And it now has a name. It's called Devon Hall. It's like a college campus name, you know.
Well,
I
yeah,
live
I
in
was
Devon
like-
Hall. It never had that name before. I just want to share that out loud.
It was
That's
just called,
a new
it was
thing.
just called My Building. That's
Right,
actually
right.
what
I
it was
lived
called.
it was my building,
Right.
right. What I loved about growing up on that street in the Bronx was my neighbors. You know, they were from all over the world. Like I grew up with, you know, like the Filipino neighbors down the hall, and then the Dominican family right below me, and then the Italian family on the second floor, and on the ground floor there was the Russian family, and like it was just this truly a melting pot in this
Right.
building. And it was wonderful because as I walked down the street, there were a number of different shops that catered to things that we would eat, you know, in our family. You know, you could buy, oh gosh, just name, I can't even think off the top of my head, anything you might need for a Puerto Rican dish.
Right.
You know, or if I wanted to try something that was traditional to, you know, a Dominican recipe or, you know, or a Central American, not Dominicans, not Central, or Haitian, or you name it, Jamaican.
Right.
There was always something down the street. So there were a number of things I loved that were around accessibility of things that felt like home, like in the Bronx. And I felt understood. And I felt like I could never possibly be bored. You know, there's just so much, there's so much kind of rich experience all around me. And yet it was also depressing. You know, there's a lot of poverty and struggle is like everybody's story. Like that's the thing, the thread. What I know, every family experienced was struggle. And we had that in common, and we wore it like a badge. You know, all of our families did. And if we wanted opportunity, it meant leaving, getting on the train and going into Manhattan. You know,
So opportunity as in jobs or?
jobs, schools, better schools.
Oh, okay.
I went to all of my schools were in the Bronx, but when I went to college, I went into Manhattan. But my elementary school, middle school, high school experience was all within a 10-block radius of where I lived, like my building.
What were the names of your schools?
I went to public school 105, PS 105,
Okay.
which is still there.
Shout out to PS
Right.
105.
Shout out PS 105, which no longer has a schoolyard, which is really sad because the school has grown in the number of students and they don't have enough space. So now they have they're like those trailers and they're in the schoolyard. So there's no schoolyard space.
Wait, so what do they do during recess?
I have no idea. Like when I grew up, we had a schoolyard. We had the
Yeah.
whole schoolyard to ourselves, and it's not there anymore.
What was the name of your middle school?
My middle school, I went to junior high school 135, Wayland Junior High School.
Are they all just numbered in New York?
Yeah.
Public school?
Well, except for my high
numbered.
school, but
Oh.
my high school had a name.
Okay.
But no, junior high school 135 is where I went
Okay.
for junior high. It was on Wallace Avenue, right up the street from where I lived.
Yeah.
And I went there for 7th, 8th, and 9th grade.
Okay.
So I know that they're a little different now, I think.
So my middle school experience was the same as yours.
7th, 8th, and 9th? Yeah.
It soon changed after that to just.
I think
believe-
6, 7, and 8 or something.
Right. I think it started at 7, 8, and then it was 6, 7, 8, and now it's like I think it's still 6, 7, 8 or something like that.
I personally loved it because it meant I was never a freshman in high school. I entered as a sophomore,
Nice.
which was,
Nice.
you know, not everybody had that experience. So I was really grateful for that. Like I have no experience of being a
Right.
freshman. I entered
Right.
in 10th grade.
So you talked about the shared experience of struggle in your building and in your community.
Yeah.
When did you sort of start? How old were you when you sort of started to understand that struggle?
11.
Wow.
It's so in. I will speak for myself. It was so in my face.
So is that why at 12 you went to work at the video store?
Partially, I'll get to that in just a moment. My high school, just so you know, was named Christopher Columbus High School,
Oh.
and it is now gone. I think that it
building?
closed.
Oh.
The building's still there, but the high school closed about 2 or 3 years ago. And it's sad to see it gone. I think that it was a really good high school when I went there, and then a couple of years later, it just went downhill. The year that I graduated, they installed metal detectors, and that was the beginning of the end for the high school. I think it has a handball court, and it has a football field that I think is off by 2 yards. It's like off by 1 or 2 yards. They spent all this money on a football field that's off. And the reason why it's off is because no one wanted to give up the handball court.
Stop.
I am not kidding. So I'm somewhere. I don't know that I have pictures. If I can find them,
I need those.
We have to find them somehow online. Like they're the story of basically the useless football field.
Christopher Columbus High School, Bronx, New York.
Yep.
Football field. Got it.
Yep, and handball court. Really. Handball was the thing. So that was the high school. But your question about the struggle. So when I was 11, my grandfather passed away, and I had a really close relationship with him. The last husband that she had, essentially. But he was the only grandfather I knew. So while we weren't related by blood, he was the person that I knew as my grandfather, picked me up from school for lunch or after school, like almost every day when I was in elementary school. So my experience was seeing him on a daily basis, seeing him and my grandmother, but really him on a daily basis with multiple touch points throughout the day. And so for me at that time, losing him was just an awareness of no longer having that kind of support. And I felt an inner struggle of not having that touchstone every day. And it was my 6th grade. I was starting 6th grade, so it was my last year in elementary school at the time. And it was that year that we decided to move across the parkway. My father bought a house, a 3-family house, and we moved across the parkway. And 2 buildings down from our 3-family house was a video store. And I felt like I needed to work to feel connected. And the man who ran the video store was the same age as my grandfather. And he had kind of that grandfatherly demeanor. And so I felt really at home. I would go to the video store to rent videos, and then I would end up talking to him for hours. I always loved talking to elders. And I would talk with him for hours, and he would talk about always about the good old days in Puerto Rico, and New York is good for nothing. Oh, my kids just want to keep me busy, so they bought me a video store. He had me in stitches. His name was Louis. He had me in stitches all the time and reminded me in a lot of ways of my grandfather. So I started working there. I kept working there until I was in 11th grade, I think. Wow. I stayed there for a while, and I left to work in Manhattan. The reason why I noticed the struggle was partially when I started working at that video store, talking to Louis about his experience having come from Puerto Rico to the States, and his kids being priority, being given opportunities, but everything is always, you got to work harder than everyone else. I mean, I heard this my whole life. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. And they were insistent that my brother and I graduate. They didn't even care what we ended up doing. They would just graduate. Just graduate, like whatever subjects, you're interested in, great, be interested in anything or nothing, but just graduate. Right. And then it was go to college, Right. Conversations I remember having with Louis were just reminded me of listening to people in my building growing up, and how people would cry on New Year's Eve. I have this memory of old people crying on New Year's Eve, like in just nonstop tears. I remember asking my mother once, I had this one experience with our neighbor downstairs, and I said, Mom, why do people cry on New Year's? And just, want to know why. And she said something about they're grieving whatever losses they have had, or that another year has passed and they made it through. And it was just that. Wow. I think I was 12 when she said that. I'm like, oh my gosh, the struggle. I hear this phrase, the struggle is real. And I'm like, yeah, that's been like a tape in my head, my whole life. The struggle is real. We made it through another year. Wow. We paid our rent. We're still living in this building. Right. We still have a job. We're still alive.
Right.
And so I remember having that awareness. I'm probably too young, you know? But so much of it came from I love talking to old people. Yes, I'm saying that out loud. I enjoy talking to older people. And I loved it when I was a kid.
For sure.
Wow. I just can't imagine. No, I'm thinking 12 years old,
Yeah.
6th grade. I had some friends who also worked when they were in 6th grade. But looking back now, at the time, I thought, oh, wow, I'm so grown up working. But looking back, I know it was because they had to help support their family.
Yeah.
And that's so young
That's
to
super
do
young.
that.
And it's true.
12 years
The helping the family part was part of that too.
Yeah,
But
Right.
what I have to say is, I wish I could have done that differently. I wish I would have done that differently because I don't have a memory of never not working. I don't have a memory of
Being a
there's
child.
always been being a child, but always, if I was in school, it was school. Oh, and then I have to remember I'm working too. And so really wearing multiple hats became a norm. And that I feel like is a parallel to the immigrant family experience, and then so I didn't think there was anything wrong with that. I thought, well, I'm just following what everybody does. This is not hard because struggle is normal.
Right. Yeah.
And it wasn't until I want to say my mid 30s where a light bulb went off of, I don't remember a time where I didn't work. I don't remember a time where I wasn't juggling multiple things, and I don't complain about them, even when I think it's warranted to complain about them, but I don't. And that's just my experience of you just don't complain because you're lucky to have a job, a roof over your head, and all all the things I remember hearing. But I think in somewhere along the way, it did me a disservice to work all of that time. Because I think I just ended up saying yes to what was in front of me instead of really thinking about, is this what I really want? I would interview for jobs, and if they said yes, I'd just say, yeah, okay, I'm going to work there. And I made a commitment to working wherever it was for however long, even if I didn't want to be there. And I see people now oh, you don't like that job, you just change. You can do that? Look, I'm having this. What?
What?
You can't do that.
Right.
Why didn't I think of that?
The struggle is real. You better stay where you are.
Exactly. And that was what was ingrained in what I learned was, no, you get an opportunity, you take a hold of it and you don't let it go.
Happy to be there. Right?
Yeah. But I did love working at the video store, and I think it has served me over time, with the memory of people coming in saying, hey, I'm looking for a movie that's, great for, 15-year-olds and has, a little bit of sci-fi, a little bit of fantasy. Again, wouldn't normally know how to answer that question, but we watched almost all the movies that we bought. And so I learned how to have conversations about, hey, why don't you try watching this?
Right.
And of course, spent a lot of time watching movies.
So now, do you know a lot of movies?
Way too many.
Do you still watch a lot of movies?
I do. Not as many. Because after I worked at the video store, I ended up working at a music store. So I actually spend more time. I love music. So I spend more time listening to music. I know.
What music store?
Wait,
Coconuts.
Before we get to the music store.
But I want to know if you've heard of Coconuts.
I've never heard of Coconuts. But before
I haven't either.
And the only reason why I'm stopping is because we've talked about this rabbit hole of music that we never get out of. So I don't want to...
So put boundaries around it.
Yes.
Okay.
So, but wait. Before we move on, do you remember the name of the movie store?
At the Movies.
Was
That was the name of
movie
it, At the Movies.
store? Do you remember the address?
It was, I don't remember the exact address. It was on, I think I may have a recommendation letter, though, that has the address on it. Somewhere I can dig it up.
Do you know if
It was on Wallace Avenue. And not Leidig. I can't remember the street that was going this way. But it was on the corner. It's no longer there. But it was next to a laundromat. I mean, there was At the Movies. Oh, At the Movies, a little bodega, which is do we have bodegas here? I don't even know.
There are no
No.
bodegas.
Okay.
here. So
Do you know what a bodega is?
So wait,
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
Before we explain what a bodega is, to those listening that may not know what a video store is.
There we go.
Before Netflix.
Before Netflix.
Before DVDs.
Before DVDs. There were these places that used to carry a ton of videos, VHS videos, and you used to be able to rent these videos for 1 to 3 to 7 nights at a time, depending on how much you would pay.
And it depends on whether it was a new release or an oldie.
And you would get charged if you didn't rewind the video the whole way.
Rentals were like $1.
Yes, Google it. Just Google it. Hollywood Video, Blockbuster, all of that. But so now you
Scarecrow Video.
Yeah, Scarecrow is still with us. That's here. Yeah.
Okay. Bodega.
So bodegas, I grew up with always going to the corner, either the corner store, even if it wasn't on the corner. Most of the corner stores were not on the corner.
Yep.
Then there were a couple that were, but we call them the bodegas. And the bodega is where you can get, everything from milk to candy to beer, although we didn't do that. Like if you needed like adobo, like seasoning for your meal, like they had that stuff. They had
adobo seasoning.
Yeah. They did. They had adobo seasoning and ice cream, like just like ice cream pops and lotto tickets. Like this is the store that you go to that's got a sampling of stuff.
Okay.
And things like candles, candles with
Toilet
the saints
paper.
on them.
Oh, yeah.
Like that. Not taper exciting, scented candles, but like the ones that have the saints on them, or like a prayer for like the money candle. Do you need money? Buy this money candle.
Buy this money candle.
This is the healing candle. If you have prayers for healing, I actually remember going to buy these things.
Wow.
Tell us about Coconut Records. Or is it Coconut Records or Coconut Records Store?
It's just called Coconuts.
Okay,
so
tell us about
Coconuts. Coconuts was owned by, I think it's Trans World America Music Company, and they were around in the 90s. I think the late 80s into the late 90s. They were around as first a record store, then they had cassettes, and then
record store.
When I worked there, they were promoting CDs. Like CDs were fairly new. I started working at Coconuts, I think it was in 1991 or 92. I think it was 1991. But I might be off by a year, because I think I worked there for 2 years and then I graduated from high school. But that was my favorite job, I think. Aside from running a bookstore, the music store was awesome. There was always music on in the house, always. And my brother and I would stay up to watch Friday Night Videos, the precursor to MTV and VH1. And Friday Night Videos, if you didn't catch it when it was happening, and you didn't have a VHS recorder, there was no watching it. So we would stay up late on Friday nights to watch Friday Night Videos. Nice. And so music was always like a central part of our lives. And what I loved about working at Coconuts was being introduced to other genres of music. I already had an eclectic taste. At the time that I started working there, I remember I liked, everything from, I loved The Cure. And then I used to listen to freestyle, so I always had to have Lisa was on my playlist, and that next to The Cure, that's like, what? They don't go well together. But then I got introduced to classical and world music, but it wasn't called world music at the time. Like they had them categorized differently, and they had a new age section. I'm like, what's that? Because I was still into tarot cards at this time. New age as in the books new age, but I didn't know there was new age music. That opened up. Wow. Whoa. And country, and just really cool to be exposed to all this different kind of music. And people would come in, and I had an ear for it. So people would come in and say, I just heard this song on the radio. It goes, la, 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 la. Oh, that sounds bad. And I would be like, is it, pick something from the flock of seagulls? I'm like, yeah, that's it. I don't know where that came from. I could hear something, and there it was.
You were the original.
You caught
Shazam.
it.
Yeah, Shazam.
And I love Shazam. But I loved that, and I loved recommending, when someone come in and say, hey, I'm having a celebration for, 25 years of, marriage, and want to give my partner a romantic, CD. Like, ooh, Harry Connick Jr. was big at the time. Like, we're going to pick Harry Connick Jr., right? Oh, no, and George Michael, too. He was big at the time, too. I'm like, we've got to give him, Listen Without Prejudice here. Listen to that with your partner.
Nice.
Right? So, volume 1. I loved that job, and that has influenced for me how I listen to music now, and that I still put playlists together. I've been doing that. I do it for now for teaching, but I've always put playlists together. Like music has shaped my life.
That's cool. I was just thinking about how when you said people would come into the store asking, I need music that fits this situation. That doesn't happen nowadays. I think people just Google, or they're just like, 70s music. Okay, got it. Playlist. It's a pre-populated playlist or whatever that someone else made, and they just play it. It's funny. Like, they don't really ask. Yeah. They just assume this is going to be good. Mm-hmm. They don't really ask, oh, you're knowledgeable in this. Yeah. Tell me more.
Well, and there's so much relationship building that happens in retail, or it used to happen in retail. Mm-hmm. And I felt like, in the video, whether it was in the video store or at Coconuts, there was like conversation not only about, hey, what's new, or what kind of song or CD might go really well with this kind of event, but it was also like, hey, where were you when you listened to that song? Or I have this memory of listening to it was one of the songs on that George Michael's CD, and there were 2 floors to Coconuts, and I have this memory forever etched in my mind. This couple started dancing in the middle of the aisle. Like, as soon as that song came on, and I didn't really listen to that song like on my own, but every time I hear it now, I have this memory. I see the couple like in the middle aisle, like, between the 2 rock sections, slow dancing, and that's so cute. It's just a memory, that's there. And,
was Coconut like a mom and pop record store?
No, it was part of Trans World Music Corporation. Meant that it was a number of different music stores, and I can't remember some of the other ones that were part of. Like, Coconuts was one of a few different chain music stores. Apparently, they didn't make it to the West Coast, but Coconuts was big on the East Coast.
Okay, shout out.
They were all over Manhattan.
You mentioned before you got into tarot card reading. Mm-hmm. Tell me about that.
I started when I was a kid.
Okay.
So I was exposed to tarot cards when I was probably, I don't know, like as early as 2 or 3.
Wow.
So my mom had a woman, again, she's going to be like, how could you say this out loud? My mom used to get readings regularly from a woman who was like an aunt to me. And she, of course, my mother, we never went anywhere without my mother. And I mean that, like, I've never had a babysitter. That's like we went everywhere with her. And so this includes going into this little shop, and there was a tarot reader in the back. And her name was Milagro.
Where was the shop?
She worked at a number of different shops in the Bronx.
Okay.
And so she was always in the Bronx. And I remember going to over a dozen shops from the time I was 2, from the time I was in my early 20s. Because I think she had to stop when I was in my early 20s. She was in her 80s, maybe.
Oh, wow.
But she would read for my mom, and then because I was a curious kid, I was painfully shy, and I loved pictures, loved them. I just became obsessed with these cards, and I always wanted to play with them, and I wanted like a set for myself, and I would look at them and I would see stories. And so when I was, I want to say it was either 10 or 11, I got my first deck of cards. I got my first deck of cards, and it came really natural to read them. And I didn't read them for fortune telling. I read them as like they were my friends, and they were telling me a story. And I would actually look at them. I never read a book about, at the time, I never read a book about tarot cards. But I would look at them and see, I would ask, because my mother would ask questions. So I would just come up with questions and then look at the cards and see, well, what are they telling me? And they became like confidants. Like, they're going to tell me a truth or give me a perspective that no one else would give me, and to my most deeply personal questions that I wouldn't say out loud to anyone else. And that's kind of the experience I had with them. And I still have, like, I've accumulated decks from that time, from 10 to 11. I have like well over almost 400 decks. Like, I've just accumulated all these years, and it's been a central part of my life, my whole life. I read every day. And then, of course, you know, when I was in high school, friends were like, will you read for me? And it was always like, does he like me?
Right.
Are we going to get back together?
Are we going to be married?
Yes. And, you know, I don't do those kinds of readings anymore because I'm much more, it's not that I'm much more interested in other things. I love using cards to help people learn about themselves.
Right.
You know, and like not so much make decisions about like the predictability of your future, but more like, how do you want to influence it yourself?
Right.
You know, how do you want to know yourself better so that you can make different decisions?
Wow.
You know, that's kind of what I use it for. I believe in free will. I know that there are people who are like, well, if a tarot reading says this, and then that's what's going to happen. I'm like, I don't think so. I think that you always have a choice. It can tell you, if you stay on this path, this trajectory, this might happen.
Right.
And yes, there's a part of me that believes that some things are fated. But I also believe that as your consciousness changes, it means that you can change your life in meaningful ways, and whatever that means for you.
Right.
And so I have this experience of tarot cards when I was a kid, of my mother going in for a reading to get information about how she can improve her life, you know, or how she can understand whatever dynamic was happening and make better choices. And so I have that memory because I used to listen to the conversations. And when I got my own deck, I was like, well, I want to do the same thing. You know, like these images help me know myself.
Right.
And they still do that. And all these years, I've never, ever, ever had a moment of, oh, this is boring. Never. Like, it's just not possible. They've been around since at least the 13 or 1400s.
Right.
They have so much history. And I think they're cross-cultural. You know, and I think about the first deck that I was exposed to was the Spanish tarot. Everything on it was written in Spanish. But the first deck that I was given as a gift, I think it was a mother piece. So it was primarily images of women. It was a feminist deck. So cross-cultural, which was nice.
Subliminal messaging.
Yep.
Nice.
Of course, my mother was horrified because half the women on there were naked. She was like, oh my God, my daughter's like 11. But it wasn't sexualized. It was just, you know, hey, look up the mother piece deck. Almost everybody's naked on it. But it had a lot of imagery of powerful, like tribal women from different cultures. And so I just got this message that, you know, women are powerful.
Absolutely.
It's awesome.
Wow.
You know, and when I got introduced to more Eurocentric decks, I was like, that's a lot of patriarchy. Before I understood what the depth of that was. But of course, the history goes back to somewhere in Europe. So there's an argument between Italy and France of who started tarot in the 1300s. And so, of course, it has a patriarchal influence.
Right.
It's going to, but it also has stories that are universal. Like, we all have an experience of saying, I want to be away from my family so I can know myself. Right. So we play the fool. Sometimes like, oh, I'm going to take a leap of faith. I'm going to leave the house. And it just, the journey goes on. And it doesn't matter who I read for, where they grew up, what their primary language is. They can always see something reflected in their life experience in cards. And the cards don't even have to look like them. Right. But it's just, oh, there's a moment, there's an image that speaks to me. Wow. For me, that's part of my culture. Tarot is a part of my culture.
For sure.
My personal culture.
For sure.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about the woman that your mother used to go to.
Milagro?
Yes. I'm thinking about the video store owner. I'm thinking about the record store. I'm thinking about the number of like entrepreneurs that you had access to. Tell me more about the entrepreneurs that influence what you do today.
It's primarily my father. I actually didn't recognize Milagro as an entrepreneur until I started reading for people, you know, and really, if I think about it, she was the first entrepreneur I was exposed to. But I didn't really see her as one because my parents didn't identify tarot reading as a career.
Right.
You know, even though that was that was her life's work.
Yeah.
Right.
But my father, when he first came to the U.S., he worked for, I'm trying to remember the name of the Silmac Glass Company. In 1988 or 89, he started his own glass company, Zarus. It's after St. Lazarus. So he called it Zarus Glass. It was how connected my family was to, okay, you know, the saints will always be there to guide you, to watch over you. And St. Lazarus, I think, was, I'm going to forget this, but I think he was like the patron saint of healing for those who were destitute or suffering from illness. And, you know, I think both my father and mother really resonated with him, like wanting to be of service. So he chose the name Zarus Glass and started his own company. And he did it with, when I say very little business experience, like none, but he had such passion and love for, you know, for the work that he did. Was a really nurturing manager, and to a fault. Like he would never let go of an employee. Like even when he needed to, he just wouldn't do it. And because of that, he would not ask for help. One of the reasons why my parents were so pushy with me and my brother about getting an education was they never wanted us to be in a situation where we didn't have an answer. So they always wanted us to be resourceful, and we were. But he never asked for help even when he needed it. And so my father was an entrepreneur who had a successful business until the economy started to show signs of struggle. And then he didn't know how to ask for help, and his business went bankrupt. And as a result, we lost our house.
Wow.
And there was a lot of shame and sadness around that for him and for all of us. And it was shocking. But he was the first entrepreneur that I knew. And the one that I think when I always wanted to do my own thing. Like when we were talking about culture earlier, like the first idea I ever had in high school was I wanted to start a magazine, because I was part of the literary group, called Emerging Cultures, because I was so fascinated by living in an environment and being someone who's really, even though I'm Latina, I'm a mixed between two very different Latin cultures.
Right.
And I knew so many people who had that experience, but no magazine ever talked about that. And I think it was before like Latina magazine. And even when that came out, it was just like the Latina experience, as if it's a singular thing.
Right.
And you know, I remember going back in my journals in high school, like Emerging Cultures just came up over and over again. And I didn't know how to do it, but I knew I wanted to. And the same idea came up in my 20s, where I saw this building in Harlem. It was this abandoned school, or not an abandoned school, but it wasn't a functioning school. Like, I want to buy a school and I want to open up a multicultural school. Like with no money and no experience, no educational background whatsoever. I was a freshman in college and I had this idea. But the reason why I'm mentioning this is I always had ideas and always wanted to do something that would be service oriented, that would be community oriented, that would kind of highlight a multicultural experience. And yet I always came back to the fear that I would fail the way that my father did. You know, and it's not a bad thing to fail, but I always had this feeling of, oh my gosh, what if people are relying on me and I can't, you know, provide the security and stability that I grew up hearing I needed. You know, stability, security, and struggle's always underneath the 3 S's. It's right there, you know? I just stopped myself multiple times from doing it, because if I couldn't do it right, and if I couldn't guarantee that it would be stable, secure, and successful, even with struggle, I wasn't going to do it. And so he was the first. I think that in hindsight, Millie was the first entrepreneur I was exposed to, because she had her own gig before my father had his own business. But I think he was the one that I recognize as the first entrepreneur. It was beautiful watching him. You know, I was a teenager at the time, and it was beautiful watching him, and it was really sad, you know, when things didn't go well, and they didn't have to not go well. Like, again, in hindsight, they didn't have to, but he didn't have the language. He was very proud, very proud. And he was not going to say, I'm struggling. Even though, again, it's an unspoken thing. But he is the reason why I think I waited so long.
Right.
And yet, if I look at it, it also has influenced the desire to want to, you know, to do
Absolutely.
something. But
And so tell us what you do now.
oh, I do 3 things now that I absolutely love. So I finally, since I was 11, I've been working, or 12, so I've been working. In 2014, I left my full-time job at the University of Washington. And I was terrified of leaving and not having any sort of like anchor. Like I've never not had a job. How am I going to do this? But I have this deep love for what I do. I teach Nia classes, and I'll come back to that in a moment. I'd left to teach Nia to do tarot counseling, which I do one-on-one with people. And I call it counseling because it's not, for me, they're not just readings. And when I say not just readings, I think readings are important, but they're counseling in that it's a dynamic conversation that's really centered around using the images to stimulate a conversation, and that some of that may be connected to an emotional memory, some of that may be connected to like a wish or a desire that you have, but it's conversational, and it's really not about telling you here's what the cards say are going to happen, but how do you want to use this information to mold an experience for yourself. And so for me, there's a counsel with a big C, like involved in that. Yeah. Like the cards are your collective counsel, and how do we use those to guide you? And so I do that. So I teach Nia and do tarot counseling with people. And then when I left my full-time job, I had always wanted to create a blend of movement, or whether you call it dance or movement, it's movement, or our bodies move, and I call it a dance, but some people don't identify as dancers, so we call it movement. A blend of movement and tarot, and what's the intersection of the two. This for me I wasn't an academic tarot person. Like I didn't learn through going to like a certificate program. I have read tons of books, but my approach was more, I look, I feel, I experience. And then when I was in grad school and had this experience with Nia, I realized I'm a somatic learner, and I didn't even know what that was at the time. I grew up with a learning disability, was always in resource room, which is like kind of like a version of special ed. And it was because I'm a kinesthetic learner, and I didn't, there was no language around that.
Right.
And I learned it in grad school, and I was like, blew my mind when I realized, oh my gosh, I actually learned through doing. I learned through feeling. I'm tactile. And it was through this Nia experience that we had in our second weekend in grad school. And Nia's tagline is, through movement, we find health. And the premise is that if you choose joy in any moment, that your body will respond. It creates a feeling of wellness and health. And yes, it combines, dance and martial arts and healing arts, but it's really the blend of those things that address that you have a mind, a body, a heart, and a spirit. So, and aerobics is just like, it's just your body, it's your muscles and bones, right? Which is fun too. And dance can be just about the choreography, but the emotion in the choreography. And yoga is about, I'm going to center my mind. I'm really connecting with the stillness within, and at the same time working on flexibility and strength. But Nia is just this blend of, I'm a human being that wants to express herself or himself or whoever it is, to express myself in a certain way. And that changes moment to moment depending on what my experience is. And yet I also have functional movement. I have to learn how my body works. I have, a lot of bones and a lot of muscles, right? And we have these major organs, and there are different ways to move to activate everything in your body. And Nia does that. And then there's a part of it that says you can have this high of this experience, and then you want to also ground yourself to be in your body so that you know that you can respond in any given moment when you're feeling stress, where you're feeling sadness, that you know how to bring yourself back. And the healing arts does that. That's what yoga is so useful for. And any kind of technique that addresses your breath and alignment. It's saying, come back, get grounded. And so it does all of those things. And it blew my mind the first time I had the experience, because it's not about choreography. And even though I am Latina, I had some difficulty with coordination. Such difficulty with coordination. And I never liked being in a fixed pattern. And there's nothing that's fixed in Nia. Before I did Nia, I did West African dance and Afro-Caribbean dance. What I loved about that was its connection to archetype, its connection to the gods, the goddesses, to nature. Like there was the dance of water, you know, the ocean, the sea, the river, the dance of thunder and lightning. And so those are the things that I responded to. And then that studio closed in Manhattan, and that was the only reason why I stopped going. It was because it closed. Then I discovered Nia a few years later, and it had that same quality, that kind of archetypal journey of, you know, expressing the warrior within, you know, or the more sensual part of who you are, or the part of you that is becoming agile, kind of responding, contracting and expanding at the same time. And I thought, this is addressing all of me, and yet it doesn't ask me to maintain a pattern. It says, do it your way. And so no two people ever look alike in a class, which is beautiful to me, you know, because while I love seeing like synchronized swimming and synchronized dancing, is too much pressure. And I kind of like the wildness of, here's a pattern, do it however it comes natural for you, right? So for me, Nia opened that door, but it's how I read cards. I read them in a kind of non-linear, organic, wild, and archetypal way. And like, what would happen if I merged these? So coming back to the answer to your question, the third piece is Arcana dance. And Arcana means, for me, the broader meaning of Arcana is the secret. It's a secret to be revealed. And dance is movement to music. So for me, Arcana dance is a secret that's revealed through the dance. And we use cards. We use tarot cards as entry points to stimulate the secret, you know? And there's music, and there's organic movement that's guided, and it's different every time. It's very personal. This is not choreographed dance, but it's taking an archetype and saying, if I were working with the archetype of the mother, how would I move? How would I move with my current identity as a mother, or a mother having been mothered, versus how I want to be mothered? And what does that feel like if I let my body have the experience? Like, we have so many people that come in for readings and they're like, I want to be more confident. Like, you can't think yourself into confidence, but you can try it on physically. You can try it on with your posture. You can try it on by simply lifting your chin. And there are different things that you can do to give your body a message, but we spend so much time in our minds that, and tarot people spend a lot of time in their minds, that for me, that the intersection of the two is really important in bringing people back to the importance of your body in shaping your experience. And so Arcana dance is my baby. It's 3 years old, you know, and growing every day and kicking my butt every day, because it's like it's its own. It has its own soul as a business. But I love it, and I just want to keep doing that. And I love Nia too, because Nia is how I got into this. It was my portal. You know, it taught me everything I know about movement, about my body. And so while it's Arcana dance and Nia are very different experiences, there would be no Arcana dance without my foundation in Nia. You know, and so I honor them both. I teach them both. And in the middle, like if it's a triad, there's, you know, here's Nia, here's Arcana dance, and at the very top, it's tarot. You know, because that to me is like the top of the pyramid in my life.
Where do your cultures and dance intersect?
I love this question.
Yes.
I hadn't considered it before, whether or not they even intersect. But when I started thinking about it, they really do on so many levels. The types of dance that I've chosen over time, the ones that I've been most responsive to, were not ballet, not jazz, not the things that I was most exposed to, but you know, the Afro-Caribbean dance and West African dance, the classes that I went to in New York. I mentioned responding to them because they had sort of this archetypal, kind of this underlying story that you're telling with your body. You're telling the story of the healers, the warriors, the ocean, the wind, and all of that just really spoke to me and reminded me of how I grew up. having this relationship with saints, with gods and goddesses. Now I have another way of accessing those stories, not just through prayer and not just through ceremony and ritual, which I grew up with, but now through dance. And there's a whole other expression. And I mentioned how shy I was. So it is not natural for me to get up and dance. And it helped that this class was packed and I could just blend in. Where they intersect was the dances that I've chosen, including Nia and then the Arcana dance, have given me an expression for this relationship that I have with unspoken things, whether it's nature or my own spirituality. It gives me a way to express it in a way that's relatable. And that creates community, that we have a common experience of what does it mean to dance love? What does it mean to dance strength, or to express like the mother within or the father within or whatever it might, or the teacher within. And it gives me relationship with people. But it also, I think dance does this, where dance and culture intersect. It allows us to tell stories that are sometimes joyous, but sometimes so painful that there are no words. There's only the movement. And it allows us to express emotion that we may otherwise like suppress. And so for me, dance is just like emotion in motion. It gives you some way to express something, and it doesn't have to be in a dramatic way. I'm not a theatrical person. And so for me, it's like, does it feel real? Like, can you feel the weight of sadness? Can you allow your whole posture to change so that you feel the heaviness and the contraction that comes? But you can contract when you feel joy. Like everything in you wants to just kind of like burst. When you're feeling joyful, the natural posture is out, not in.
Right.
And so I think for me, dance does that. When I say does that, it gives me an ability to express emotional truth, but also cultural truth too. Because it doesn't require language. It doesn't require that I explain to you a belief,
or even how you're feeling,
or how I'm feeling, or a value that's dear to me. I can express it. So I love that you asked that question, and it's also ancestral. It's like I get to tell the stories of the people that came before me and honor them. Through that their legacy is not lost. Because so much of our cultures are rooted in movement.
Absolutely.
And nonverbal storytelling and oral storytelling. But, all of that, there's a legacy that gets passed down and it gets reinterpreted.
Right. Well, and I just think about your story about going with your mom to the tarot card reader and like just what an impact that part of just your life had on it. And so it is this mixture of so many different experiences coming back to you, which is super awesome. How can folks connect?
Super easy right now. I have a website and an email address that's really long, but worth remembering.
Okay.
So
we'll put it in the description.
Yeah. So my website is jenniferluceroearl.com, and the Earl has an E at the end.
Okay.
So Lucero is my maiden name, and Lucero means bringer of light, like loose. So I love holding on to that name. And then Earl is my married name, and it's got an E at the end. So my email address is jennifer@jenniferluceroearl.com.
Nice.
Really easy to find. What I want to share is I absolutely love everything that I do. That's awesome. I really do. And for me, the part of Lucero bringing light, no matter whether I'm teaching a class or working with someone one-on-one or, hosting a workshop or a retreat, my intention is always to activate or bring out the lightness in the person in front of me. That means that there's a unique beauty to each of you, and why hide that luminosity, in whatever way. And it can sit alongside sadness, and it can sit alongside anger and angst and all the things that we feel. But there's always a light that can be activated if we just remember that, oh, you know what, I'm this awesome soul, and there's no one like me. How cool is that?
I like that.
But thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you both.
Yay!
Yay!
We did it! This is Jennifer Lucero.